Her hand shot across the table so fast, the iron spoon clattered to the ground. She grabbed the mountain man's wrist with both of hers, her knuckles white. Her breath gone, and every voice in that tent went dead quiet all at once. "Please." Abigail Mercer whispered, her voice splitting down the middle like green wood. "Don't eat it." Silas Boone looked down at her hands on his. Then he looked at her face. And for one terrible second, nobody in that room moved at all. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you for a long, long time. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The annual Frontier Survival Feast had been running in Teller Creek for 11 years, and in all that time not one woman had ever won it. Not one woman had ever entered either. The men who came to compete were serious men, mountain hunters, cattle ranchers, trail bosses, and the kind of wealthy landowners who wore expensive coats in cold weather just to prove they could afford to waste warmth. The prize this particular autumn of 1883 was bigger than it had ever been, a 2-year mountain supply contract worth enough money to carry a man through 3 hard winters without once worrying about the cost of flour or salt. The judges, 3 of them all appointed by the Railroad Association, sat at a long table at the far end of a canvas tent large enough to shelter 20 horses, and they did not smile once the entire morning. Abigail Mercer arrived at 9:30 with a broken left wheel on her wagon, a single iron pot wrapped in burlap strapped to the seat beside her, and $43 to her name. She did not arrive quietly. The wagon listed hard to the left when the wheel finally gave out completely, and the sound it made dragging across frozen ground was enough to pull every head in the camp toward the road. She climbed down from the seat herself. There was no one to help her, and she hadn't expected anyone, and she was breathing hard by the time her boots hit the dirt. She was a large woman, not merely heavy, broad-shouldered and round-bellied and solid in the way that spoke of real physical labor rather than indulgence. Her dark dress straining at the seams across her back, her hair pinned up under a battered felt hat that had seen better decades. She pulled the iron pot down from the wagon seat with both arms straightened up as tall as she could, and walked toward the registration table without once looking back at the broken wheel. The first laugh came from somewhere to her left. "Lord Almighty," a man said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Somebody send the cook home before she eats the competition." A second voice picked it up. "Which one is she entering, the eating contest or the cooking one?" The woman behind the registration table, a thin, pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who organized the camp's social functions, looked up from her ledger and blinked. Twice. Her eyes traveled slowly from Abigail's boots to the top of her hat, and something moved across her face that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but was thoroughly familiar to Abigail all the same. "Ma'am," Mrs. Hargrove said carefully, "this is the Frontier Survival Feast, for competitors." "I know what it is," Abigail said. Her voice was even. She set her iron pot on the table between them with a sound like a judge's gavel. "I'm here to compete." Mrs. Hargrove's mouth opened, then closed. Then she looked past Abigail toward the group of men near the fire, as if waiting for one of them to come explain the situation. Nobody moved. "The entry fee is $2, Mrs. Hargrove said at last. Abigail pulled $2 from the front pocket of her dress and set them on top of the registration ledger without a word. Mrs. Hargrove stared at the coins for a long moment. Then she wrote down the name. She wrote it very small, like she was hoping it might disappear between the lines. Abigail carried her pot to the far end of the cooking row, set it on the iron grate over an open fire pit, and started to work. She did not speak to anyone. She did not look up when the laughter started again behind her. She did not react when a young man walked past her station and said something that made his friends howl. And she kept her hand steady when one of the judges strolled by, glanced at her setup, and walked on without slowing down. She had learned over the years how to make herself very quiet inside while everything outside stayed loud. The contest ran until noon. 14 men competed. 3 dropped out early when their pots boiled over or their fires burned uneven. The remaining 11 presented their dishes to the judges one at a time, and the judges tasted each one with the same carefully neutral expression, professional disinterest worn smooth by repetition. When they reached the far end of the row, one of the judges, a heavy-set man named Bellows, actually laughed when he saw the station. Not the polite sort of laugh, the kind that assumes no consequences. "This the last one," he said to the other 2. "Appears so," said the second judge, a narrow man with an impressive mustache and very small eyes. The third judge said nothing. He was the youngest of the 3, and had been saying very little all morning. Bellows picked up the ladle. He was already smiling when he lifted it. He was already preparing the face he would make the exaggerated taste, the dramatic shudder, the kind of performance that would get a good laugh from the men watching nearby when someone stepped in front of him. It happened fast. The man was tall. Not just tall, built in the way that suggested something beyond ordinary physical size, something worn into the bones by years of hard living in extreme country. He wore a dark canvas coat that had been repaired in at least 3 places, and a hat that had no particular shape left to speak of. His face was angular and weathered and entirely without warmth, and his eyes, dark as creek water in shadow, moved across the cooking station with a kind of focused attention that did not belong to idle curiosity. Silas Boone was not entered in the competition. He never was. He came every year because the railroad men who financed his hunting lodge expected him to show his face at civic events, and Silas did what was financially necessary and nothing beyond it. He had been standing near the edge of the tent for the better part of an hour, watching without appearing to watch, which was something he did very well. He had watched Abigail arrive. He had watched the broken wheel and the pot, and the $2 laid flat on the ledger. He had watched her work for 3 hours without looking up once, and he had watched the judges walk past her station the way men walk past things they've already decided aren't worth their time. And now he was standing between Judge Bellows and the iron pot, and he was reaching for the ladle himself. "I'll taste it," he said. Bellows stared at him. "Boone, this isn't—" "I said I'll taste it." It was not a loud statement. It didn't need to be. There were men in Colorado who would have walked into a burning building before they argued with Silas Boone in that particular tone of voice. And Judge Bellows, whatever his other failings was, a man who understood certain social physics. He stepped back. Silas lifted the ladle. He looked at the stew, dark and thick, fragrant with something he couldn't immediately name, not quite venison and not quite rabbit, but something in between, layered with dried herbs and what smelled like pine resin, and something else. Something older and deeper that reached into a part of his memory he'd long since boarded up. He brought the ladle toward his mouth. And that was the moment Abigail's hands came across the table. Her grip on his wrist was surprisingly strong. Her face had gone strange, not frightened exactly, but stripped of the careful blankness she'd been wearing all morning. Something raw underneath it now, something that looked almost like grief. "Please," she said. The word came out quiet and cracked and entirely unguarded. "Don't eat it." The tent went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, the way sound sometimes simply stops when the wrong thing happens. Silas looked down at her hands. He looked at her face. He looked at the pot. Then he looked at her face again, and something moved behind his eyes, not quite recognition and not quite confusion, but a kind of careful attention that had shifted into a different register entirely. "Why not?" he said. She didn't answer. He took the bite anyway. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no visible reaction, nothing that the watching men could point to later and say that was the moment. Silas stood completely still with the ladle at his mouth, and then he set the ladle very slowly back into the pot, and the hand he used to do it was not entirely steady. His jaw worked once. Twice. Then he turned and looked at Abigail Mercer, with an expression that no one in Teller Creek had ever seen on his face in 11 years of frontier feasts, in years of cold contracts and hard winters, and the kind of silences that accumulate around a man who has chosen to live mostly alone. He looked terrified. Where did you learn this recipe? His voice had dropped to something just above nothing. Abigail let go of his wrist. She took a half step back. Her chin was up, but her hands, when she pressed them flat against her skirt, were shaking slightly. From my mother, she said. Who learned it from hers? What was in it? Silas said, not as a question. The dried bark. The kind they use in survival camps when the meat runs out. Abigail said nothing. My mother used it, he said. I haven't tasted it since I was 9 years old. The silence in the tent had become a different kind of silence, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that people standing in the periphery of could feel pressing against their chests without knowing exactly why. Judge Bellows looked at the other two judges. The narrow man with the mustache was watching Silas with the expression of someone who has suddenly realized they are standing in the wrong room entirely. Your mother, Abigail said finally. Her voice was steady, but barely. Where did she learn it? Silas turned to look at her fully for the first time. Not the quick assessment he'd given her when she arrived. The real kind of looking, the kind that takes inventory of something that matters. She was in a winter camp, he said. Up near the Sangre de Cristos, 1862. She was part of a supply convoy that got caught in early snowfall. They survived 4 months on whatever they could make from dried meat and foraged bark. He paused. She came home with a recipe written on the back of a shipment manifest and a cough she never got rid of. She made this stew every winter for 6 years before she... He stopped. Before she what? Abigail asked. Before she disappeared, he said. Winter of 68. She was on a supply run. She never came back. The two of them were looking at each other now in a way that had made the surrounding noise retreat further still, the watching men and the judges and Mrs. Hargrove's pinched face, all fading to something imprecise and peripheral. I'm sorry, Abigail said. Don't be. His voice had gone flat again, not unkind but sealed over. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it shorter. He looked at her for a moment. Something flickered. No, he said. It doesn't. Bellows cleared his throat aggressively. Boone! This is highly irregular. You're not an official taster. Write her down as a finalist, Silas said without looking away from Abigail. Now just a moment. Write her down as a finalist, Bellows. He turned then, and the look he gave the judge was brief and entirely sufficient. Unless you'd like to explain to the railroad committee why you disqualified the only entry that actually used proper frontier survival techniques. Bellows opened his mouth, closed it, picked up his ledger. The narrow-faced judge beside him made a small sound of discomfort and studied his shoes. Mrs. Hargrove, watching from 3 stations down, pressed her lips together until they disappeared entirely. By the time the official results were announced an hour later, Abigail Mercer had not won. Second place went to a man named Calloway who had entered a slow-smoked elk roast that the judges had been more comfortable acknowledging. But she had been listed. She had been tasted. And the tall man in the repaired coat had eaten a second spoonful before he walked away and had not spoken to anyone else for the remainder of the afternoon. That evening, when most of the camp had retreated to the main lodge for the prize supper, Abigail was still sitting by her fire pit, the iron pot cooling in front of her, doing the arithmetic in her head that she had been doing since she arrived. $43. No prize money. Broken wagon wheel. The nearest town with a livery was 14 miles back down the mountain, and she was not going to make it there before dark, and she was not going to spend the money. It would cost to stay in the camp's boarding tent for the week. She was staring into the coals and running the numbers again, and coming up with the same answer when Boots stopped in front of her fire. She didn't look up right away. She had learned also, over the years, not to look up too fast. You didn't win, Silas Boone said. I noticed, she said. Bellows is a coward, and Calloway's elk was fine, but not exceptional, for what it's worth. It doesn't pay my wheel repair, she said, but thank you. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him settling his weight slightly, not sitting, just shifting the way a man does when he's deciding something. I have a lodge, he said. Up the north face, about 4 hours' ride. I take hunters and railroad men up there in season, feed them, house them, send them back with something to show for the trip." He paused. "I've been without a cook since September. The last one left because of the altitude." Abigail looked up then. His face in firelight was harder to read than it had been in the tent. The shadows cut everything differently. "I'm not a servant," she said. "I didn't say you were. I'm not going to sleep in a supply closet and eat after the guests." "The cook's quarters are attached to the kitchen," he said. "Separate entrance. Private. And the pay." He named a figure. It was higher than she'd expected, and her face must have shown something, because the corners of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, like a door opening a crack. "There's one condition," he said. She waited. "You teach me what's in that stew." His voice had gone quiet again the way it had in the tent. "All of it, every ingredient, every step." Abigail looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp perimeter, a horse shifted and blew out a breath, and the wind moved through the pine high above them with a sound like the turning of very old pages. "You said your mother disappeared in winter of '68, she said. "Yes." "What was the name of the convoy she was with?" Something changed in his face. Slight, controlled, but there. "Why?" "Because my father drove supply wagons out of Pueblo from 65 to 71, Abigail said. "And he came home in the winter of '68 with a cough he never talked about, and a recipe he said came from a woman he couldn't find again." She picked up the iron pot and set it in her lap, both hands curved around it, the way a person holds something they cannot afford to lose. He said she taught it to him in 4 days, while they were snowed in together, waiting for the pass to open. He said she was the best camp cook he'd ever met. Silas Boone stood very still. The fire between them popped once loud as a gunshot. "Her name," he said, and the word came out like it cost him something considerable. "He never told me her name," Abigail said. "Just that she was brave and she was kind, and she made the best use of bad ingredients he'd ever seen in his life." She looked up at him. "But he wrote her recipe down on the back of a shipment manifest." The silence that followed was not an empty one. It was the kind of silence that forms around the exact moment when two separate stories, traveling alone for years in opposite directions, recognize each other across a fire. "I'll take the job," Abigail said. She set the pot back on the grate and stood up, and she was taller than people expected when they were done making their first assessments, and she held out her hand the way a businesswoman holds out her hand, square and direct, and carrying no apology for anything. Silas Boone looked at her hand for a moment. Then he shook it. His grip was careful. Not weak. Nothing about the man was weak, but careful the way a person handles something they've decided matters. 4 hours ride, he said. We leave at first light. I'll need the wheel fixed first, she said. I'll have someone see to it tonight. And I keep my own hours in the kitchen. Nobody comes in while I'm working without asking. Agreed. And the recipe... She stopped, looked at him with something direct and serious in her face. I'll teach it to you. All of it. But not yet. Not until I know more about that convoy. He studied her. The firelight moved across the angles of his face, and for a moment he looked younger than the years of mountain living had settled into him, looked like someone who had been carrying a question for a very long time and had just unexpectedly found someone who might know the answer. Fair enough, he said. He pulled his hat down and turned toward the camp. Mr. Boone, she said. He stopped, but didn't turn all the way. Why did you taste it? She asked. After I told you not to. A beat of silence. Because you told me not to, he said. Then he walked away into the dark. Abigail stood by her cooling fire for a long time after he was gone, her hands resting on the iron pot. The smell of bark and dried herbs, and something ancient and surviving, still rising faintly from the coals. And she thought about her father's handwriting on the back of a manifest, and a woman in a mountain camp who had survived a winter that should have killed her and then gone back into the mountains anyway. And she thought about how far a story has to travel before it finds the person who needs to hear it. She banked the fire, wrapped the pot back in its burlap, and started making a list of what she'd need to restock before the ride north. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. That had never stopped being both the hardest and the truest thing about her life. The ride north took closer to 5 hours than 4, because the trail above the first ridge was worse than Silas had described, and better than Abigail had feared. And she spent most of it in the back of his supply wagon, with her iron pot wedged between 2 crates of salted pork, watching the tree line thicken above them, and thinking about her father's hands. He had been a careful man, her father. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with the few stories he chose to tell. He had come home from that winter convoy in early 1869, thinner than she'd ever seen him, with a new quietness behind his eyes that she hadn't known how to read at 12 years old, and hadn't fully understood until she was grown. He had written the recipe down in his small, methodical handwriting on the back of a folded manifest, and he had tucked it into the pages of her mother's Bible. And when Abigail found it there years later, after her mother was gone, after her father was gone, after she was 22 and married, and already beginning to understand how quickly things disappeared, she had copied it 3 times onto separate pieces of paper and kept all 3 in different places. She still had all 3. She thought about that the whole ride up. Silas said nothing for the first 2 hours, which suited her fine. He drove with the reins held loose in one hand, his eyes on the trail, his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is thinking but has no intention of sharing what about. Abigail had known men like that. Her husband Emmett had been one, not cold, just interior built inward, rather than out, the kind of person whose silences were crowded with things they hadn't yet decided to say. She stopped thinking about Emmett. She was practiced at that. It was the 3rd hour when Silas spoke. "How long have you been traveling alone?" She had been half dozing against the side crate, and the question brought her back sharp. 3 years, she said. "Since your husband." She looked at the back of his head. "You heard about that. Mrs. Hargrove talks," he said, "and sound carries in a tent. My husband died in the winter of '80, she said. We were moving west from Missouri. Early storm caught the convoy on the pass above Raton. He went out to check the wagon ties and didn't come back." She said it the way she always said it, flat and factual, the emotion pressed down so far under the surface that only she could feel it moving. "I lost the baby 2 weeks later." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "You said that already." "I meant it both times." She looked at the trees. 3 years, she said. "I've been cooking for mining camps and trail crews and anybody who'd pay me enough to keep moving." She paused. "I was good at it. I got better. And then I heard about the Teller Creek feast and the supply contract, and I thought—" She stopped. "You thought you had a real chance," he said. "I thought I had the best dish," she said. "Which isn't the same thing. I know that now." "You had the best dish," Silas said. "Bellows knew it too. That's why he laughed before he even tasted it." Abigail turned that over. "That's a strange kind of compliment." "It's the only kind worth anything," he said. "The ones that cost somebody something to give." She looked at the back of his head again. He was not the kind of man she had expected. She hadn't been sure what she expected. The reputation that preceded Silas Boone through the mountain counties was not a gentle one. Feared was the word that came up most. Effective was the second one. The men who hired him to guide their hunting parties came back with what they'd paid for, and they came back safe, and they didn't come back with many stories about warm conversation around the fire. "The lodge," she said. "Tell me what I'm walking into." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, 8 guest rooms. A common dining hall that seats 20 comfortably and 30 badly. Kitchen with a working stove, good 1 iron, not the cheap kind. Root cellars well stocked through autumn. "I take hunting parties up from October through January, usually 2 or 3 groups overlapping. Railroad men mostly, and the kind of businessmen who think hunting something in the mountains will make them interesting at dinner parties." "Do they tip?" "Not unless you make them want to." "I can do that," she said. Something shifted in his shoulders. Not quite a laugh. The ghost of one. "I expect you can," he said. They rode in silence for another hour, and then the lodge appeared at the end of the trail, and Abigail looked at it without speaking, because she was making a different kind of assessment now, not the kind that judges a place, but the kind that measures whether a place can be worked. It could be worked. She climbed down from the wagon before he'd fully stopped. It walked to the front door and pushed it open. She stood in the entrance of the kitchen for 30 seconds, counting the stove plates, locating the water pump, checking the ceiling height, noting the smoke patterns on the wall above the fire grate, and then she turned around and walked back outside. "I'll need dried sage," she said, "and more salt pork. And whoever last organized the root cellar has no idea what they're doing, and I'm going to fix it tomorrow morning." Silas stood by the wagon with the reins still in his hand, and this time what moved across his face was something closer to an actual expression. Something that might have been in a different man relief. "I'll get the sage," he said. She was in the kitchen before 7 the next morning, and she was still there at 9 at night, and somewhere in between, she had reorganized the root cellar, inventoried every dry goods container in the storage room, identified a leak in the water line from the well, fixed the leak herself with wrapped rawhide and river clay, and produced the best venison broth Silas Boone had tasted since his mother was alive. He told her so. Reluctantly, the way he seemed to do most things that required admitting to a feeling. "Don't go getting sentimental about broth," she said without looking up from the pot she was seasoning. "I wasn't." "You had a look." "I don't have looks." "You had one," she said. "It's fine. It was good broth. You're allowed to say so." He sat down at the kitchen work table. She would learn in the coming weeks that he did this regularly, that the kitchen was the one room in the lodge where he didn't seem to be waiting to leave, and he set his hat on the table and looked at her. "The manifest," he said. She stopped stirring. "You said your father wrote the recipe on a shipment manifest. Do you still have it?" She did not turn around. She kept her hands moving slow and steady, the spoon tracing circles through the broth. "I told you, not yet." "You also said not until you knew more about the convoy," he said. "So, ask." She turned then, set the spoon across the pot, looked at him with the serious, direct look that she was beginning to understand one of her natural states. "The convoy your mother was on," she said. "In 62. What was it carrying?" "Supplies for the territorial survey teams, flour, salt, cured meat, medical goods." He said it like he'd recited it before, the way you recite something you memorized young. 7 wagons, 12 men, 2 women. They got caught by a storm on the South Pass in early November and sheltered in a mining camp about 6 miles off the main road. For how long? 4 months, maybe a little more. The pass didn't open until late February. Abigail's hands pressed flat against her skirt. Her father had told her 4 months. He had told her South Pass. He had told her a mining camp. "What happened when they came out?" she asked. "Most of them came back to Pueblo or Trinidad. My mother came back to Teller Creek." He paused. She was different. She didn't talk much about what happened up there. She said it was hard and people did what they had to do, and she was grateful to be home. Another pause, and this one had a different quality, something weighted in it. 6 years later, she went back up. She said one of the men from the camp had written to her. Said there was something she needed to see about the supply shipments. She took a wagon, and she didn't come home. Abigail was very still. "What man?" she said. She didn't say. She burned the letter after she read it. "Did you look for her?" "I was 14, he said. "I looked for 3 years. I never found the camp they were supposed to meet at. I never found the wagon." His voice had not changed in tone or volume, but it had gone to something careful and contained the way a person's voice goes when they are discussing something that they have decided a long time ago not to feel in front of other people. "After a while, I stopped looking and started working. It seemed more useful." Abigail walked to the work table and sat down across from him. Not close, the table was wide, and she kept a proper distance, but she sat, which felt like the right response to what he'd just handed her. "My father died in 81, she said. "Fever, not the mountains. But before he went, he told me something he'd never told me before. She folded her hands on the table. He said the convoy in 62 wasn't just a supply run. He said the cured meat they were carrying had come from a railroad company depot in Denver, and partway through the winter they started getting sick. Not all of them, just some. And the ones who got sick in a particular way. Not like starvation, not like cold. Different. Silas's eyes had changed. Something in them had gone very sharp and very still. Different how? Bitter, she said. He said it tasted bitter. The meat. He said he'd noticed it before people started falling ill. But he figured it was just the preservation process. The salt. The chemicals they were using to cure meat for long-distance shipping. He didn't say anything because he was the lowest-ranking driver on the convoy, and he didn't think anyone would listen. She stopped. Let that settle. 2 people died that winter in that camp. Both of them had been eating the cured meat from the depot shipment. The others who survived were eating what they could forage and what your mother was teaching them to cook. She looked at him. My father said a woman in that camp saved his life by refusing to let him eat from the depot supply after the 3rd week. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Silas did not move for a very long time. She knew, he said finally. His voice was a different thing now, quieter and under the quiet. Something that had been waiting 20 years to understand something and had just without warning been handed the beginning of an answer. She knew what was wrong with the meat. She knew something was wrong, Abigail said carefully. My father wasn't sure she understood what it was, but she knew it was killing people, and she stopped them eating it. She paused. He said when the pass opened and they came out, she spent 3 days writing down everything she could remember about what they'd been given. Every shipment, every date, every man who'd signed for it. And 6 years later, someone wrote to her, Silas said. Yes. Someone who knew what she'd written down. Yes. He stood up. Not fast-controlled, but the motion had something in it that was not calm. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, one hand flat on the wall, and she watched the line of his shoulders and gave him the moment he needed, because she understood from long practice what it felt like to receive information that rearranged the geography of your grief. The railroad company, he said. My father thought so, Abigail said. He was never sure. He was a wagon driver, not an investigator. But he kept the manifest. He kept everything they gave him from that convoy, and the recipe on the back of it. She stopped. The recipe is written in a woman's hand, not my father's. Silas turned around. The expression on his face was one she would remember for a long time. Not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but the particular look of a man who has spent decades building a story about loss around a gap where the truth should have been, and who has just been shown without warning that the gap is not empty after all. Show me, he said, the manifest. Not tonight, she said. Abigail, not tonight. She said again, and her voice was firm and not unkind. Because once we open that, we can't close it again. And I want you to be sure you're ready for what it might tell us. She looked at him steadily. Because if the railroad company knew what was in those meat shipments in 1862, and they've been running supply contracts through this territory for 20 years since... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Silas stared at her for a long moment. The fire in the kitchen stove snapped and settled. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like something vast, breathing slowly. You've been thinking about this for a long time, he said. Since my husband didn't come home, she said. The convoy he was on in 80, it was a railroad supply run, contracted out of the same Denver depot. She held his gaze. The meat in that convoy tasted bitter too. His trail partner told me so afterward. Said Emmett had complained about it twice the day before the storm. Her voice was completely level. Her hands on the table were completely still. I've been thinking about it for 3 years. Silas looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the tent, the real kind, the inventory of something that matters kind. You didn't come to Teller Creek for the supply contract, he said. No, she said. You came because the railroad men who judge that contest are the same ones who run the Denver depot. I came... Abigail said, "because I needed them to taste my food, because I needed to be in the same room, because you can't find out the truth about powerful men from the outside of the rooms where they make their decisions." She stood up. "And I needed someone who already had a seat at their table." The fire crackled. Silas picked up his hat from the table. He stood there holding it, not putting it on, looking at her with something that had moved past surprise and past calculation, and had arrived somewhere quieter and more serious. "You planned this," he said. "I planned part of it," she said. "The rest I'm building as I go." He put the hat on, slow, deliberate. "What do you need from me?" he said. And Abigail Mercer, who had survived a blizzard and a grief that should have broken her and 3 years of moving through mountains alone, looked at the most feared man in Colorado and told him exactly what she needed in plain words without softening any of it. Outside, the wind picked up. The pines bent and straightened. The mountains, old and vast and entirely indifferent to the plans of small human beings, held their ground. But inside the kitchen, something had shifted into place. Something that felt, if you were paying the right kind of attention, a great deal, like the beginning of something that was going to be very difficult to stop. The first hunting party arrived 3 weeks after Abigail did, and they were exactly what Silas had described: men with expensive coats, and the particular confidence of people who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion they valued. There were 6 of them. 3 railroad investors out of Denver, 2 land speculators from Santa Fe, and a territorial judge named Aldrich, who had the soft hands of a man who had not done physical labor in 20 years, and the sharp eyes of one who had never stopped paying very close attention to everything around him. They rode up the North Face Trail on horses that cost more than most families in Teller Creek made in a year. And they came into the lodge dining hall, stamping cold off their boots and talking over each other in the loud, overlapping way of men accustomed to having rooms arrange themselves around their comfort. Abigail served them supper. She did not introduce herself. She came out of the kitchen with the first course herself, because the lodge had no serving staff beyond a teenage boy named Cody, who helped with firewood and horses, and she set the bowls down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fed difficult people in difficult conditions for years, and had long since stopped being impressed by either the difficulty or the people. The man at the head of the table, a broad-shouldered investor named Garrett, who seemed to have appointed himself the group's social director without anyone formally agreeing to it, looked at her when she set his bowl down and said, without any particular cruelty, the way people say things they don't think require justification, "Boone, you got yourself a cook." "I did," Silas said from his end of the table. Garrett looked at Abigail with the frank assessment of a man evaluating livestock. "She any good?" "Ask your bowl," Silas said. Garrett looked at the bowl. He picked up his spoon. He tasted it. And whatever he had been prepared to say next did not get said, because his face did the thing that Abigail had watched faces do her entire adult life: the involuntary surrender, the moment when a person's body decides something before their pride can intervene. "Lord," he said quietly to no one in particular. Abigail went back to the kitchen. She listened through the closed door. She always listened through closed doors. It was one of the most useful things she had learned to do, and she had learned it young, in the way that people who are regularly dismissed learn to gather information from the edges of rooms rather than the centers. Over the following 2 weeks, she listened to a great deal. She learned that Garrett was the primary financial architect behind a new meat preservation contract. The railroad was pushing through the territorial government before the spring legislative session. She learned that the contract, if it passed, would give a single Denver-based supply company exclusive rights to all cured meat distribution across 6 mountain counties for 15 years. She learned that 2 of the men at her table had already signed preliminary agreements with that company, and that Judge Aldrich was being asked to certify the contract's legality through a territorial court process that was supposed to be independent, but demonstrably was not. She learned all of this by bringing soup and clearing plates and refilling coffee, and being, as far as anyone at the table was concerned, entirely invisible. And every night after the guests had gone to their rooms and the dining hall had gone quiet, and Cody had banked the fires and gone home to his family in the valley, She sat at the kitchen work table with Silas and told him what she had heard. The first night he listened without saying much. The second night he started asking questions. By the fifth night, he had pulled out a map of the territory and was marking supply routes with the focused concentration of a man who has spent his life reading landscape and has just realized the landscape in question is not geographical. "The Denver Depot," he said on the sixth night. "The one that supplied the 62 convoy. It's still operating." "Under a different name," Abigail said. "But the same owners. I checked the incorporation records in Trinidad before I came to Teller Creek." She slid a folded paper across the table. "The founding partner in the new company is a man named Holt. Thomas Holt. He was a junior official with the original Territorial Supply Authority in 1862. Silas looked at the paper. His jaw worked once. "Holt is one of Garrett's primary investors." "I know," she said. "He's expected at the lodge for the winter banquet," Silas said. "First week of December. Garrett invited him. He's bringing 2 others from the board." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her across the table. The firelight was doing its thing again, cutting shadows across the angles of his face. "You're planning to do something at the banquet?" "I'm planning to cook," she said pleasantly. "Abigail, I'm planning to cook," she said again, and this time the pleasantness had an edge to it, deliberate and precise as a filleting knife. "And while I'm cooking, I'd like you to help me get access to the lodge's incoming supply records. Everything that's come through Garrett's railroad contract. Going back as far as we can." He was quiet for a moment. "And the manifest?" She nodded. "And the manifest." "It's time." She went to her quarters and came back with an oilskin packet wrapped twice in burlap and tied with a cord she'd knotted herself in a pattern her father had taught her. She untied it at the work table while Silas watched, and she unfolded the outermost document with hands that were not quite as steady as she would have liked. The manifest was old. 21 years of folding and unfolding had softened it along the creases to something close to cloth, and the ink had faded to a pale brown that required concentration to read. But it was legible. The official header, a Territorial Supply Authority seal, a reference number, a list of cargo was legible. The signatures at the bottom were legible. And on the back, in a woman's handwriting, small and careful and slightly tilted to the right, was the recipe. Silas reached across the table and stopped with his hand an inch from the paper. "May I?" he said. She pushed it toward him. He picked it up. He read the front, first the cargo list, the route, the dates. She watched his face while he read, and she saw the exact moment he found what he was looking for. Because something moved through his expression that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but was entirely unmistakable. "Holt," he said. "Thomas Holt. He signed for the meat shipment. Second signature from the bottom," she said. He turned the manifest over. He read the recipe. He read it slowly, the way you read something that you are trying to memorize and also trying to survive reading. And when he set it back down on the table, his hand stayed flat on either side of it, as if he needed to keep it from moving. "It's her handwriting," he said. Abigail said nothing. She gave him the silence he needed. "She signed the front, too," he said. "Her name is there, on the cargo acceptance line." He touched it with one finger. "Eleanor Boone. She signed for the delivery." He looked up. "She was one of the official witnesses. She signed for the shipment that poisoned the camp." "And then she spent 6 years figuring out what she'd witnessed," Abigail said quietly. "And when she finally had enough to tell someone, someone made sure she didn't get to tell it." The fire snapped. The wind outside pressed against the walls of the lodge. Silas sat with his hands flat on his mother's handwriting and looked at the recipe she had used to keep people alive and said nothing for a long time. "I want Holt at that table in December," he finally said. "He'll be there," Abigail said. "And I want proof, not just the manifest. Proof of what's in the current shipments. I've been collecting samples," she said, "from every delivery that's come through Garrett's contract. I've been setting aside portions from each crate in sealed jars in the back of the root cellar. labeled dated and matched to the shipment manifests. She paused. "I've been doing it since the second week." He stared at her. "Since before you told me any of this?" "I wasn't sure I could trust you yet," she said simply. "I needed to see how you handled your guests first." And she looked at him steadily. "You treated Cody like a person," she said. "Every single day. You never raised your voice, never shorted his pay, never made him feel small in front of the guests. That told me what I needed to know." Something crossed his face that was too quick and too unguarded to be anything but genuine. He looked away first. "The banquet," he said. "What do you need from me?" she told him. "All of it." And this time, he didn't interrupt once. The weeks between that night and the first week of December moved fast and did not move easily. 3 more hunting parties came and went. Abigail fed them all and listened and added to her collection of sealed jars in the root cellar. And at night she and Silas worked through the supply records with the methodical focus of people who understand that the kind of truth they are looking for does not reveal itself to impatience. What they found was worse than she had expected and exactly as bad as she had feared, which was a distinction that mattered to her and might not have mattered to anyone else. The Denver depot had been sending adulterated meat through railroad supply contracts across 6 mountain counties since at least 1874. The adulteration was chemical, a combination of compounds used to extend preservation and mask spoilage that were in sufficient quantity and over sufficient time, quietly toxic. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like poisoning. In a way that looked like winter illness, like altitude sickness, like the ordinary attrition of hard living in hard country. People got sick and got better, or didn't get better, and if they didn't get better, it was the mountains that killed them, or the cold, or the season. Not the meat. Never the meat. Abigail found a ledger in the supply records from a 1879 contract tucked inside a water-damaged crate, manifests folder that no one had apparently looked at in years, that listed in careful columns the quantity of the preservative compound used per shipment and the per-unit cost savings versus standard preservation methods. It was, in its way, the most chilling document she had ever seen, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary, so completely mundanely administrative. A cost reduction calculation, a business decision, with no column anywhere on the page for the people on the other end of the shipment. She brought it to Silas at 11 at night and set it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Emmett," she said. "My husband. He was on a supply convoy in 80. 3 weeks into the trip, the meat started tasting wrong. He told his trail partner. He was going to report it when they got to the next depot." "But he didn't get to the next depot," Silas said. "No," she said. "He went out to check the wagon ties in a blizzard and he never came back." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this. She had practiced it for 3 years because she knew eventually she would need to say it out loud to someone who needed to hear it, and she needed to be able to say it without falling apart. "I don't know if it was the storm. I don't know if it was something else. I may never know." She flattened her hand on the ledger. "But I know what was in the meat. And I know who signed the contracts. And in 3 weeks, they're all going to be sitting at your dining room table eating my food." Silas looked at her hand on the ledger. He looked at her face. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to give them the best meal they've ever had in their lives," she said. "And then I'm going to show them that I know exactly who they are. They'll deny it. They can try," she said. "But I'll have the ledger. I'll have the jars. I'll have the manifest with Holt's signature and your mother's handwriting. And I'll have every supply record going back 6 years that Garrett left in this lodge because he thought nobody here was capable of reading them." She looked at him calmly. "And I'll have you." He was quiet for a moment. "You'll have me," he said. The night of the banquet arrived on a Thursday in the first real cold snap of December, when the temperature had dropped below 0 by nightfall, and the pass road was glazed with ice, and every man who rode up to the lodge that evening did so with the animal knowledge that they were not getting back down tonight. Which was, Abigail had known for weeks, exactly the point. 14 men sat down to dinner. Garrett at one end, Silas at the other, and between them, the full architecture of what had been quietly built over years of contracts and signatures and carefully unattributed harm. Holt and his 2 board members. Judge Aldrich, the land speculators, the lesser investors who perhaps knew something, and perhaps only suspected and had made the decision that what they didn't officially know couldn't touch them. Abigail cooked the entire meal herself. She brought out the first course and the second and the third, and she watched these men eat her food with the focused pleasure of people who consider a good meal one of the rewards of their position. And she listened to them talk about the spring contract, about the legislative session, about Holt's timeline for rolling out the new preservation process to additional counties, and she kept her face the way she kept it in public, which was professionally composed and entirely unreadable. Garrett, somewhere between the second and third course, leaned back in his chair and said to Silas across the noise of the table, "Where'd you find her boon best cook in the territory, and you've been hiding her up here all season?" "She found me," Silas said. Garrett laughed. "Well, whatever you're paying her, it ain't enough." Abigail, refilling the water pitcher at the far end of the table, did not smile. She looked at Thomas Holt, who was sitting 3 seats from Garrett, and Holt was not looking at her, because she was the kind of woman he had spent his whole life not looking at, which was, she had come to understand both his greatest weakness and hers greatest advantage. She went back to the kitchen. Cody, who had been sent home early with double his usual pay and a firm instruction not to come back until morning, was long gone. She went to the root cellar. She brought up the jars. She set them on the kitchen work table in a row, 14 of them, each one labeled in her careful handwriting, date, shipment number, depot reference. She set the ledger beside them. She set the manifest beside that. And then she set the supply records bundled and tied with cord in a neat stack at the end of the table. Then she went to the kitchen doorway, and she waited. It was the sound of the chair that reached her first, the specific sound of a heavy chair scraping back fast, the way chairs move when the person in them can no longer remain seated. Then a voice she didn't immediately recognize, saying something sharp and alarmed. Then Garrett, "Holt. Holt, what's—" Then Silas's voice cutting clean through everything else. "Someone get him water." Then silence of the wrong kind. Abigail walked into the dining hall. Holt was half out of his chair, one hand on the table, his face the particular gray-white of a man whose body has decided to override his intentions. The man beside him had stood up and was gripping his arm, and every other face at the table had turned toward the disruption with the varied expressions of men who are trying to determine whether this is serious or whether it is going to be an inconvenient story they'll have to tell later. Abigail walked to the center of the room. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already gone the way rooms go when something unexpected has broken the surface. And in that particular quality of attention, she spoke clearly and without hesitation, and said the thing she had been building toward for 3 years. "Gentlemen," she said, "before anyone else takes another bite, there's something you need to know about the meat in this territory." The dining hall went so quiet that the wind outside the lodge walls sounded like something alive pressing to get in. 14 men stared at her, some with confusion, some with irritation, and at least 2 she clocked them immediately, the way she always clocked the ones who knew with something much closer to fear, dressed up as outrage. Garrett was the first to speak. He had the particular social reflex of a man who had spent his career controlling rooms. "Ma'am, this is a private dinner, and I don't know what you think you're—" "Sit down, Mr. Garrett," Silas said from the far end of the table. His voice was quiet and entirely final, the way his voice got when he meant a thing completely. Garrett sat down. Garrett sat. Abigail walked to this kitchen doorway, picked up the first bundle from the work table inside the supply ledger, the manifest, the stack of records tied with cord, and brought them into the dining hall. She set them at the center of the table, with the same unhurried deliberateness she set soup bowls down. Then she returned for the jars. 14 of them, 1 trip, 2 hands. She set them in a row in front of the centerpiece, like a second course nobody had ordered. Holt still half collapsed in his chair with his associate, hovering uselessly beside him. looked at the jars, and his face did something involuntary and unmistakable. He recognized them. Not the jars. The contents. The color of the preserved meat inside, the particular quality of the brine. He recognized what he was looking at, and his body knew it before his mind could construct a defense. And for 3 full seconds, every person at that table could see it happening on his face. Judge Aldrich said carefully, "What exactly are these?" "Samples," Abigail said. "One from each shipment delivered to this lodge under Mr. Garrett's railroad supply contract over the past 8 weeks. Each one labeled with the date of delivery, the shipment reference number, and the depot origin." She opened the ledger to the page she had marked, set it flat on the table, and turned it to face the room. "And this is the cost reduction ledger from the 1879 contract cycle, which documents the quantity of chemical preservative compound added to each batch above standard food safe levels and the per-unit savings that resulted." Nobody moved. Garrett's face had gone through 4 separate expressions in the span of 30 seconds and had landed on something that was trying very hard to be contemptuous. "This is absurd. You're a cook. You found some old paperwork in a supply crate, and you've decided to make a scene at a business dinner." "The ledger has your signature on page 3, Abigail said pleasantly, "under the section marked Authorized Cost Adjustments." Garrett stopped. The man to his left, one of the Santa Fe speculators, who had up until this moment been a largely decorative presence at the table, pushed his chair back 6 inches without appearing to notice he'd done it. "This is slander," Holt said. His voice had recovered some of its steadiness, though not all. "You can't walk into a private function and make accusations against—" "I'm not making accusations," Abigail said. "I'm presenting records. There's a difference. Accusations require proof. Records are the proof." She pulled the manifest from under the ledger and laid it flat. "This is a territorial supply manifest from October 1862. It documents a shipment of cured meat sent from the Denver depot, your depot, Mr. Holt or your predecessors, which amounts to the same thing since you acquired the company in 1871 and inherited every liability with it, to a survey convoy operating in the Sangre de Cristos. 2 people died in that convoy over the following winter. The cause was recorded as mountain fever." She paused. "It was not mountain fever." Holt stood up. "I won't sit here and listen to—" "You'll sit," Silas said. He had not moved from his chair at the end of the table. He had not raised his voice. But something in the way he said it, or something in the way he looked when he said it, or simply the accumulated weight of what Silas Boone meant in these mountains, Holt sat. "Mr. Holt." Silas's voice was level and absolutely without warmth. "My mother's name was Eleanor Boone. She witnessed that 1862 shipment. Her signature is on the front of that manifest on the cargo acceptance line. She spent 6 years figuring out what she'd signed for." He let a beat pass. "In the winter of 1868, she received a letter and went back into the mountains to meet someone who told her they had proof. She didn't come back." He looked at Holt steadily. "I'd very much like to know who wrote that letter." The fire in the dining hall hearth snapped and threw light across the table. Outside, the wind hit the walls in a gust that rattled the window frames and died. In the sudden silence after it, every man at the table seemed to become aware simultaneously that the pass road was iced over, and the temperature outside was below 0, and nobody was going anywhere until morning. That awareness moved through the room like a current. The speculator who had pushed his chair back found himself very still in it. Garrett looked at Holt. Something passed between them. Quick practice, the shorthand of men who have navigated difficult situations together before. And then Garrett turned back to Abigail with the expression of someone choosing a new strategy. "Let's say hypothetically that there were some irregularities in the preservation process years ago," he said. "Errors in formulation. The science was less refined then. Nobody intended—" "My husband is dead," Abigail said. Garrett stopped. His name was Emmett Mercer. He was on a supply convoy in the winter of 1880, contracted through your railroad. He reported that the meat tasted wrong 3 weeks into the trip. He was going to bring it to the next depot. She looked at Garrett without blinking. He went out to check the wagon ties in a storm and never came back. His trail partner told me the storm wasn't that bad, not bad enough to lose a man who knew mountains. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. That was 3 years ago. I've been collecting records since then. The room had changed. She could feel it, the shift in weight, the adjustment of alliances that happens when men in a group begin calculating individually rather than collectively. When the shared understanding that they are in a room together starts competing with the individual, understanding that they may not all survive this room equally. Judge Aldrich, who had said very little since the beginning, picked up the ledger. He read page 3. He turned to page 7. He was the kind of man Abigail had assessed weeks ago, who processed information faster than he processed loyalty, and whose ego was architectural rather than personal. He cared less about being on the right side than about being on the side that history would record correctly. These authorization signatures, Aldrich said to Garrett, not looking up from the page. How many contract cycles do they span? Harold. How many cycles, James? Garrett's jaw tightened. I'm not discussing this here. You're going to discuss it somewhere, Aldrich said, setting the ledger down with the precise care of a man who has decided a document is now evidence. And I'd strongly suggest you prefer here tonight with people who might theoretically be persuaded toward some form of measured response over a territorial courthouse in the spring with a public gallery. He looked around the table. We are trapped in this lodge until the ice clears. We are going to discuss this. What followed was not loud. It was in many ways worse than loud. It was the specific sound of a structure collapsing from the inside, quietly. The way things fall when the load they've been carrying for years finally exceeds what the foundation can hold. Garrett talked first. He used words like oversight and formulation error, and we had no way of knowing the cumulative effect, and each sentence was a small, careful retreat from the one before it. And Abigail sat at the edge of the room and listened to every word, with the focus of someone who has waited a long time to hear a particular kind of confession and is making sure they are hearing it correctly. Holt didn't talk at all for the first hour. He sat with his arms folded and his face arranged into something professionally blank, and Abigail watched him and understood that he was the one she needed to be most careful about, not because he was the most dangerous, but because he was the most controlled, and controlled men had more options than panicked ones. It was close to midnight when Holt finally moved. He stood up, pushed his chair in with deliberate calm, and said, I'd like to use the necessary. Cody will show you, Silas said, and the teenage boy who was not in fact gone, who had been sitting in the kitchen at Abigail's quiet request since 10 o'clock, appeared in the doorway with the specific expression of a 15-year-old who understood that he was participating in something significant and was determined to be useful. Holt looked at the boy, looked at Silas, understood that the necessary was the necessary and nothing else tonight. Fine, he said. He came back 7 minutes later and sat back down, and when he sat down, he looked at Abigail, really looked at her for the first time all evening with the expression of a man who is recalibrating. What do you want? He said. The directness of it caught some of the other men off guard. Garrett looked at him sharply. Thomas, she's been building this for months, Holt said without taking his eyes off Abigail. She's not here to embarrass us at a dinner party. She wants something specific. I'd like to know what it is before we spend another 4 hours pretending otherwise. He turned in his chair. So, what do you want? Abigail looked at him calmly. I want the families of every worker who died on a railroad supply contract in this territory since 1870 to receive what they're owed, she said. Compensation, not charity, not a settlement with a confidentiality clause. Compensation on record with the cause of death accurately documented. She picked up the stack of supply records. I want the Denver Depot's current preservation formula reported to the Territorial Health Authority and withdrawn from all active contracts pending independent review. She set the records down. And I want the name of the person who wrote the letter to Eleanor Boone in 1868. The room was still. Holt looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at Abigail, and she could see him doing what smart men do when they realize they have run out of better options, not surrendering exactly, but locating the terms of a surrender they can live with. "The letter," he said. "I didn't write it." "I know," Abigail said. "But you know who did." A long pause. "Hargrove," he said. "Gerald Hargrove. He was a supply inspector in '68. He'd been tracking the formula irregularities for 2 years, and he couldn't get anyone above him to act on it. He found Mrs. Boone because her name was on the '62 manifest as a witness." He looked at Silas. He meant to help her. He didn't know anyone was watching him. "Where is Hargrove now?" Silas said. "Dead?" Holt said. "Winter of '69. He fell through ice on a river crossing." His voice was flat. "It was ruled accidental." The fire popped. Nobody spoke. "Who ruled it accidental?" Silas said. His voice had gone to somewhere very quiet and very cold. Holt looked at the table. "Garrett's predecessor on the Territorial Supply Committee. Garrett had gone the color of old ash. I wasn't involved. I wasn't even with the company until '73. You signed the ledger in '79, Aldrich said without emotion. He had been writing in a small notebook for the past hour and had not stopped. "That makes you involved." By 2 in the morning, Aldrich had filled 12 pages. By 3, Garrett had stopped trying to shape the narrative and started trying to minimize his specific role within it, which was a different and less dignified exercise. The 2 junior investors had, by mutual unspoken agreement, decided that comprehensive cooperation was their best available strategy and had said more in 2 hours than they'd probably said in the previous 2 years combined. Holt signed 3 documents that Abigail produced from her oilskin packet. Documents she had prepared in advance, because she had known with the particular certainty of someone who has studied a problem long enough to see its shape roughly how the night would go. Silas witnessed all 3 signatures. At 3:30 in the morning, the lodge had gone quiet. The guests had retreated to their rooms, not with the ease of men retiring comfortably, but with the exhausted, deflated silence of men who have had something large taken from them and are still trying to understand the exact dimensions of the loss. Abigail stayed in the kitchen. She had been going for 18 hours, and her feet hurt, and her back hurt, and her hands were red from the heat of the stove, and she stood at the work table and looked at the bread she had set to rise before the dinner, and forgotten entirely which had overproofed and collapsed and come out of the oven 40 minutes ago as something dense and burnt and unsalvageable. She picked it up, looked at it, set it down, and then she sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the work table, and she cried. Not the restrained, managed kind of crying she had become expert at over 3 years of surviving alone. The other kind. The kind that doesn't ask permission, that comes from somewhere below decision, that has been waiting behind every composed expression and every careful sentence, and every night of working through supply records by firelight while keeping her hands steady and her voice even. She cried for Emmett, who had gone out into a storm and not come back, and for the baby she had lost 2 weeks later in a mining camp with a doctor who hadn't known what to say. She cried for her father, who had carried a secret home from a mountain and spent the rest of his life being careful with words. She cried for Eleanor Boone, who had survived a winter that should have killed her and gone back into the mountains, trying to do the right thing and never come home. She was still crying when the kitchen door opened. She heard the boots on the floor and didn't look up. She didn't have the energy to reassemble her face right now, and she had decided in the 8 seconds between the sound of the door and the sound of the boots stopping that she was not going to try. Silas sat down on this kitchen floor beside her. Not close, not touching. Just there. His back against the work table, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hat off and held loosely in his hands. He looked at the burnt bread on the work table above them. "That's unfortunate," he said. "I forgot about it," she said, her voice wrecked. Understandable given the evening. She pressed the back of her hand against her face. "I don't do this," she said. I'm not the kind of person who—" "You just spent 3 years building a case against a railroad company while cooking for mining camps and traveling alone and losing everything twice," he said. His voice was entirely without judgment. "You're allowed to sit on a kitchen floor." She looked at him sideways. Her face was blotched and honest, and she didn't try to fix it. "Your mother," she said. "I'm sorry. I know tonight wasn't. I know that finding out what happened to her isn't the same as finding her." "No," he said. "It isn't." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "But it's more than I had yesterday. And I know who to look for now." A pause. "Hargrove may be gone, but men who rule accidents accidental leave paper trails too." "Yes," she said, "they do." They sat in silence for a moment. The fire in the stove had burned down to deep coals that threw a warm, steady glow across the kitchen, and outside, the wind had quieted the way it sometimes does in the very small hours of a mountain night, as if even the weather occasionally needs to rest. "Abigail," Silas said. She looked at him. "You don't have to earn your place here anymore," he said. She stared at him. The words landed somewhere she had not been prepared to have anything land somewhere undefended, somewhere she had not realized she'd left open. She had been so focused on the night's purpose on the documents and the jars and the signatures on the thing she had come to this mountain to do that she had not left any space for the possibility that someone might say something to her that had nothing to do with the task. Her throat closed. "I don't know how to stop," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 years. "I know," he said, "but you can learn." He stood up. He picked up the burnt bread from the work table and set it in the ash bucket with the care of someone disposing of something that deserved a dignified exit. Then he held out his hand. She took it. He pulled her up with the same careful grip he'd used when he shook her hand at Teller Creek. Not weak, not performative, just honest and steady and completely sufficient. "Go to sleep," he said. "The pass will clear by mid-morning. The guests will want breakfast." "I'm not making them breakfast," she said. Something moved in his face. The door opening a crack thing. "Fair enough," he said. He walked to the kitchen door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "The recipe," he said. "My mother's handwriting on that manifest." He didn't turn around. "Thank you for keeping it safe." She didn't answer right away. She looked at his back, at the repaired seams of his canvas coat, at the hat he was holding at his side in the hand that was not on the doorframe. "She kept people alive with it," Abigail said. "That seemed worth protecting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked out, and she listened to his boots cross the dining hall and go up the stairs, and she stood in the kitchen with the warm coals, and the empty work table, and the smell of burnt bread fading slowly in the air, and she thought for the first time in 3 years, without qualification, that she might be somewhere she was allowed to stay. The pass cleared by 10 the next morning, exactly as Silas had said it would. The guests left in 2 groups. Aldrich first with his 12 pages of notes tucked inside his coat, and the 3 signed documents in a leather satchel he held against his body the entire ride down, and then the others in a loose, subdued procession that bore no resemblance to the confident column of men who had ridden up 2 days earlier. Garrett left without speaking to anyone. Holt stopped at the door of the lodge and looked back once at Abigail standing in the hallway, and she looked back at him with a calm, steady expression that said everything she needed it to say and nothing more. He nodded once. She did not nod back. When the last horse had disappeared around the first bend of the trail, Cody came in from the porch and said with the direct honesty of someone too young to have learned to soften things, "Are we in trouble, Miss Mercer?" "No," she said. "Mr. Boone's going to be all right." "He's going to be fine," she said. "Go start on the firewood." He went. And Abigail stood in the empty hallway of the lodge and drew a breath that went all the way down, the kind she had not been able to draw fully in months. And then she went back to the kitchen and started breakfast for 2. Silas came down at 10:30. He looked at the plate she set in front of him, then at her, then at the plate again. "You said you weren't making breakfast," he said. "I said I wasn't making it for them," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He ate. He ate the way he always ate her food, with the particular focused attention of a man who has decided that something is worth his complete presence, which Abigail had come to understand was the highest compliment he was constitutionally capable of offering. Aldrich is going to move fast, he said between bites. He knows the legislative session is in March. If he doesn't file before the spring contracts renew, Garrett's people will find a way to bury the ledger. I know, she said. I sent copies of everything to the territorial newspaper in Pueblo 6 weeks ago, sealed with a letter explaining that if I didn't send a follow-up by December 15th, they were to open the envelope and print whatever they found. She poured coffee. I sent the follow-up yesterday morning before the guests arrived. It told them to wait for Aldrich's filing before publishing, but they have everything they need regardless. Silas put down his fork. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful assessment, not the door opening a crack, something more direct than either of those, something that had decided to stop measuring the distance. You did that before you even knew if last night would work, he said. I didn't know if it would work, she said simply. So I made sure it didn't matter whether it did. He picked up his fork again, set it down again, looked at the table. My mother, he said, Hargrove's files. If he documented the 68 meeting, if he kept records the way he kept the letters. I've already written to the Territorial Archive in Denver, she said. Under Aldrich's name because mine would have raised questions. I asked for any documents filed by a Gerald Hargrove between 1866 and 1869 in connection with Supply Authority inspections. She sat down across from him. It'll take 6 to 8 weeks for a response. But if he was the kind of man who wrote letters to your mother trying to do the right thing, he was probably the kind of man who kept copies. Silas was very still. You thought of all this, he said. I had 3 years, she said. He looked at her across the table. The real look, the inventory look, and this time he didn't look away first, and neither did she. And between them, something settled into place that didn't require words to acknowledge. Abigail, he said. Don't say anything important right now, she said. We're both tired and the coffee isn't finished yet. Say it when you mean it properly. The corners of his mouth moved. The full version of it this time, not the suggestion of a smile, but an actual one, brief and real, and startlingly different on his face than she had imagined it would be. Yes, ma'am, he said. The story broke in the Pueblo Courier the 3rd week of January, 6 weeks after the banquet, when Judge Aldrich's formal filing with the territorial court became public record, and the newspaper had everything it needed to print what Abigail had sent them, in a package that ran across 4 full pages and carried 3 separate bylines. She read it at the kitchen work table on a Tuesday morning, with Silas standing behind her left shoulder, and she read it quietly from first line to last. And when she finished, she folded the paper and set it flat on the table and pressed both hands on top of it. Emmett, she said. Just his name. Nothing else. Silas put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to. After a moment, she covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that for a while. 2 people in a kitchen in the mountains, holding the weight of it together without pretending it was lighter than it was. By February, Garrett had resigned from the Territorial Supply Committee. By early March, the Denver Depot had been placed under Health Authority review, and the spring supply contracts had been suspended pending investigation. 3 of the investors at the December banquet cooperated with the territorial inquiry in exchange for reduced liability, which meant they gave detailed testimony about a decade and a half of decisions that had been made in rooms Abigail had never been allowed into and would never have been shown into, and each piece of testimony was another name on a list of families who deserved to know what had happened to the people they'd lost. The compensation process was slow and imperfect, the way these things always are when institutions are asked to account for the harm they have spent years not accounting for. But it began. Abigail had understood from the start that beginning was the part she could force. The rest would require other people, other pressure, other years. She had done what she could do. She had to trust that it would be enough to set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. She was not always sure it would be. On the hard nights, and there were hard nights when the progress felt geological and the losses felt immediate, she sat with the iron pot and the manifest and made the stew, and the smell of it filled the kitchen and reached the rest of the lodge, and sometimes reached Silas wherever he was in the building. And sometimes he came and sat at the work table, without being asked, and sometimes he didn't, and either way was all right. That was the thing she learned slowly over the winter and into the spring, that allowing something to be all right either way was different from not caring. It was in fact harder. It required trusting that the foundation was solid enough that you didn't need to keep testing it. She had not trusted a foundation in a long time. In March, a letter arrived from the Territorial Archive in Denver. Silas brought it from the trail rider himself still in his coat, and he carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Abigail and stood back. She looked at the envelope, looked at him. "It's yours," she said. "Open it." "You wrote the letter." "To find your mother," she said. "Open it." He opened it. He read it standing at the work table, and she watched his face and did not rush him and did not look away. The kitchen was warm, and the bread she had set to rise that morning was doing what it was supposed to do, and the smell of it was good and simple and entirely real. Silas set the letter down. "Hargrove kept everything," he said. His voice had the quality of someone speaking from a long distance inside themselves. His field journals, his inspection reports, his correspondence. He stopped. "There's a journal entry from November of '68. He met my mother at a trading post south of Walsenburg. He showed her the inspection data." He stopped again. "She signed a witness affidavit to his findings, both copies. He sent one to the archive and kept one himself." He looked up from the letter. "The archive has hers, her signature, her statement, in her own words." He paused. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew it was dangerous. She did it anyway. Abigail stood up. She walked around the work table, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked at him the way she looked at things that mattered fully and without any of the managed distance she usually kept between herself and the things that could undo her. "She saved people in that camp in '62, she said. "She came back 18 years later because she couldn't stop wanting to save more. And she did. That affidavit is why we had anything to build on." She reached up and put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, the way you touch something you want to be sure is real. "You have been looking for her for 20 years. You found her." He covered her hand with his. His jaw worked once. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they are trying to hold something in and succeeding imperfectly. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "She would have argued with me constantly," Abigail said. "Yes," he said. "She would have." And this time, when he smiled, it stayed, and settled into his face like something that had finally found the right place to be. By spring, the lodge had changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Things in the mountains rarely changed all at once, but steadily, the way water changes stone, which is to say, permanently. The hunting parties still came in season, and Abigail still fed them, and they still left, having eaten the best food of their lives, and frequently having thought things about themselves and their choices that they hadn't gone up the mountain expecting to think. But the lodge was no longer only for them. Silas had set up a second kitchen, smaller, attached to the south side of the building, and during the winter months, when the high passes closed, and the miners and the widows and the families who had lost men to the mountains and the children who had no particular person to claim them, came through the valley looking for somewhere to wait out the cold, the south kitchen was open. No charge, no conditions. Eat and rest and go when you're ready. Abigail ran it. She also taught not formally, not with any announced intention of teaching, but in the way things get taught in kitchens by doing and explaining and letting someone stand beside you long enough to understand the reasons behind the steps. Cody learned first, and then the older daughter of a widowed miner who came through in November and needed winter work, and then a young man who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and couldn't drive wagons anymore but had good hands for cutting, and a genuine curiosity about how things tasted. She did not think of it as building something. She thought of it as feeding people, which she had been doing her whole life, and she was still, as she had always been, very good at it. In the towns below the mountain, the name that attached itself to her was not one she'd chosen or sought. She heard it first from a miner's wife who came up in January with 2 children and stayed 3 weeks while her husband recovered from a broken leg at the valley doctor, and who said when she left standing at the lodge door with her children beside her, and tears she was not embarrassed by on her face. "I'm going to tell everyone I know about the Mountain Mother." Abigail opened her mouth to say that wasn't necessary. The woman hugged her before she could get the words out and held on for a long moment, and Abigail stood there with her arms around a stranger's shoulders and felt the weight of it, not the name, not the reputation, but the plain human warmth of being held by someone who meant it, and she held on back. After they left, she stood at the lodge door for a little while looking at the trail. Silas came up behind her. She had learned the sound of his walk, the particular rhythm of it, the slight favor of the left side, where he'd broken his knee in a fall 10 years back, and she didn't need to turn around to know it was him. "The Mountain Mother," he said from just behind her left shoulder. "Don't," she said. "I'm not mocking it." "I know," she said. Still. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It fits." She turned around. He was closer than the usual work table distance, the managed geography they had maintained through the winter, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and neither of them moved away. "It fits," he said again, quieter this time, the word doing more work than just describing a name. "Silas," she said. "Abigail," he said. She had told him back in the autumn to say the important things when he meant them properly. She could tell by the way he said her name, steady and deliberate, and carrying everything he didn't say out loud, that he had been waiting for the right moment with the same patience he brought to everything that mattered to him, and that he had decided standing in the lodge doorway in the first real warmth of an April morning that this was it. "I'm not leaving the mountains," he said. "I want you to know that. I've never been able to stay anywhere that wasn't up here." "I know," she said. "But I can stay here," he said. "I'd like to, if you're staying." She looked at him. At the repaired seams of his coat, and the hat that had no particular shape left, and the face that had learned slowly over a winter to let things show. "I've been looking for somewhere to stay for 3 years," she said. "I think I found it in October." He exhaled a slow, careful breath, the kind that releases something held a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not the handshake grip, not the careful pull from the floor grip, just her hand in his, straightforward and unhurried in the warm April light at the top of the mountain. They stood there together in the doorway of the lodge, and below them, the valley was beginning its slow green return from winter. And somewhere in the south kitchen, Cody was burning something he would need to be corrected about. And somewhere in the territorial courthouse in Pueblo, the hearings were continuing, and the names of the dead were being entered into the official record one by one, given back at last, the dignity that had been quietly taken from them, and none of that was finished, and some of it never would be fully finished, and Abigail understood that as clearly as she understood anything. But she was here, on solid ground at the top of a mountain she had climbed on her own in a place that had started as work and become without her entirely planning it a home. She had survived long enough to stop surviving. That was not a small thing. That was, in the end, the whole thing.